opportunity to rethink. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. To rethink the relationship, and not just my relationship to critical theory and critical realism, but also, since I'm now in between, I can have the dialogue with myself. But I'm very grateful to have the chance to discuss this with you. No, but it helped. It really helped. It helped me to rethink what I was trying to do a lot, and what I will present is in some way a kind of an attempt to reformulate my own thinking and also to clarify it. But I did it really since I expected to have a dialogue with Margaret Archer. I tried to focus on her work, so I don't really want to present completely my own thinking, but I want to. Well, I'll show you what I want to do. And I really have the hope that this might also help to start what was just suggested, the general debate on critical theory and critical realism. So the title is The Speed of Social Change. That's what I've been working on all the time. The idea is that modernity is about social acceleration. I frequently use this image for it, which I find actually useful for... Yeah, okay, I will explain. I find this quite a useful image because it's a cover from a heavy metal album by Motorhead called Orgasmatron, and I find so you definitely see the speed, right? So modernity is about speeding up our world. I really believe this, dynamizing the world in the material, in the social, and even in the world of ideas, right? You actually say in the world of agency, structure, and culture with Margaret Archer. But what I like about this picture is that on the one hand, it's like a train being set on a path, so that's the structure, so to speak, right? But you also see the lust, if you so like, which I think it's the agency, right? It's the agents who embrace this idea of dynamizing the world, but it's also a structural feature of society, and it has some negative tendencies, which brings in the critique. I won't comment on this anymore. So, but to be really serious now, so what we've been discussing so far is the idea that, and Urs just repeated it, so one question is the ontology, right? Do we need a social ontology for doing social science? And I would really say, I think with critical realists that we always do, right? All social scientists implicitly use some idea of social ontology, but they don't spell it out. So I really think critical realism helps a lot to try to make a sense of this again. So I want to I have 3 points, and they are in dialogue with Margaret Archer, or how I understand her. So you might tell me where I get her wrong. So the first is on this level, and then the second is and the second is on the substantial theory of modernity, which I just already hinted at. My idea that we have to understand what's going on, the change in society, what we call dynamis in the book I've written with David Strecker and Andrea Kottmann. It's on the table too, where we say, okay, we need to understand, we need to have a view of the synthesis of society, that's the ontology, but also of the dynamis. What are the laws of change, of development, of evolution? And here I have this idea of acceleration, and I really believe that this could kind of be very complementary to Margaret Archer's ideas. Of course, I want to claim that only with the help of acceleration theory you can fill in the missing parts in Archer's work. And third is then, we call it praxis, but that's the level of critique, as Urs has just said, right? What could be wrong with this form of society? And this is, I think for today, this is for me the shortest, but also the most important point, because there it's straightforward. So, and the first is maybe the most problematic, so let's dive right into it. So on the level of ontology, Margaret Archer talks about the social system consisting of 3 components, right? I mainly refer to her latest book because that's what she sent to me in preparation for this conference, and also because I've read it most intensely, right? And she talks about 3 components, namely the structural domain, the cultural domain, and agency, right? On the micro level, so to speak, or agents. Okay, and she says these 3 realms, components, they have some independent tendencies. They are semi-autonomous, I would say. So there are there's a logic, or there are laws, or however you call it, tendencies within culture, which are not directly tied down, causally related, or at least not uni-causally to structural mechanisms and not to agents. But nevertheless, the 3 are in a kind of dialogue or in a permanent interchange, right? So the 3 levels are semi-autonomous. They have their own life, so to speak, but of course, and their own emergent properties and even causal powers, but nevertheless they affect each other. They have influences. They influence each other. So they are correlated. And then Margaret Archer says, which I very much like right in the beginning, together they make history. So we have to understand how they interact to understand historical developments on the macro level, the history of society, as well as, I believe, life histories, biographies, right? And I will show you how I think this can be done. So I said this already. But so I think it's obvious, and from Margaret Archer, also from what she's written elsewhere, it's very obvious that there are tensions between cultural developments and structural properties, or between agents' desires and needs on the one hand, and cultural and structural effects on the other. So we have to understand this history as the permanent friction, but also the tendency to mediate between these components. But the problem I see with Archer's approach so far is, or maybe with critical realism, that to me it has never become quite clear how we have to think of these relationships between structure, culture and agency. It's clear that they are somehow correlated. It's not quite clear how they are correlated, right? And then I think you always fill in, I mean you, the critical realists, which I might be one at the end of this conference, by saying it's multi-causal and very complex, but you never really know what how they relate, at least not to me, and then how the historical process needs to be interpreted. And I also think that the role of habitus is unclear, particularly if I understand the situation correctly. Margaret Archer, for strange reasons, is totally against the idea of having a strong notion of habitus in the latest book, at least, whereas I think Andrew and you and many others would say, well, of course, there is something like habitus. So let me make a suggestion on this, which should also... No, and then I think, something that confuses me too with Margaret Archer is that I don't really get the connection between reflexivity and agency. Is reflexivity agency? Sometimes it reads like this, right? So I think we need a notion of agency, but I have a suggestion which is actually a modification of what I've done myself so far, and I'm not sure whether it makes any sense. Let me just try. So this is, I think, is the critical realist ontology, right? We have structures and culture, ideas on the macro level, right? And I would say the difference is, I mean, on the one hand, we have explicit ideas, right? And since I'm somehow I've worked a lot on Charles Taylor, right? So he would of course say it's all about self-interpretations, right? So culture is the explicit realm of trying to make sense of ourselves and our world, right? So it's the level of ideas, of explicit ideas, which you might find, for example, in the Constitution or so, but in many other places. And then we have the level of structure, which I would say, particularly you could even define it as social institutions and practices, the way things are done. Now, of course, I would say, I come to this in a second. And then we have, on the other hand, we have the people, the individuals, the subjects. Of course, we know that these terms don't mean the same, but nevertheless, we have, let's say, individuals. And I would say there is a similar split. That's why I would say it's not just one, it's two. Because you find this even what I think Margaret Archer is very good in describing it, the internal dialogue has a lot to do with our explicit self-understanding, right? The ideas we have about ourselves, about who we are and what we should do, and then also our physical somatic dispositions, our habitus. I think we are permanently in dialogue with ourselves on these levels, right? I know I should go to the conference, but I'm totally tired, right? So you could really say... For example, and sometimes this gets very interesting, right? If you're a Catholic, you know on Sunday morning you should go to church, but you rather go to the maybe to the bar, or you stay in bed. So I really think there's a complex relationship here. I will say something about this in a minute too. Now I really think it's obvious that these are correlated, but the question is, how are they correlated? And I would say where they are correlated precisely in agency. So I shift agency from the side of the agents to the middle, really, because I think actions are the result of those four components or levels, because they all include norms, right? They all norms and self-interpretations. Look, I mean, for example, I thought maybe we can use the example here of Guantanamo, for example, right? So let's take the U.S. situation. On the societal self-description, they are a democratic society which adheres to the rule of law. But they have some institutions, for example, Guantanamo, which is of course very different from, I would say, right? It's neither belonging to the rule of law, but it's just, it's really, I don't want to talk about the Americans, I don't want to do American bashing, I just couldn't think of any better example, not at this point, right? Okay, oh. That's the CIA, I knew it. Okay. I don't know why this is so small, actually. I find this, you can impossibly read it, right? It's okay. Okay, so the idea is they are correlated on the level of norms and self-interpretation. So, and now there's always misfits, right? Because of the semi-autonomy and independence. So for example, I would say in this case, the self-description of the US society and this practice, and I think you could actually make same claims for the economic realm, they fall apart, and that means that creates some form of crisis, for example, potentially at least, right? Either it's an institutional crisis because people give up the institution, then Guantanamo doesn't work. If everyone says we have to adhere to the rule of law, at least not as it used to work, or it's an ideological crisis. People no longer believe in the cultural, political, and so on self-descriptions. And for Asians, it's a problem. Do they follow the explicit norms stated in the constitutions and in law and elsewhere, or do they follow the norms which are implicit in the actual practice you find there? But it's the same. Then you find the same relationship between norms and self-interpretations between individuals and self-descriptions. For example, if I don't know. I mean, you could be. Maybe you are a complete, totally fundamentalist Christian, then you might be in trouble with the self-descriptions of society, maybe not so much in the US society. You certainly are if your self-description, your individual self-image is a Muslim or Islamist or so, and I don't want to do any Islamophobic bashing either, but I just want to say that there could be, that there always are always tensions and frictions, right? And the question is then, what do you do? And thirdly, as I've already referred to, there's always a tension between what you think you should do and what your bodily inclinations, your habitus, your somatic dispositions tell you to do. Here my favorite example is, for example, you might be a conservative Catholic by conviction, but you nevertheless might be maybe a heavy drinker, or let's say you have homosexual tendencies on the body level, on the level of habitus, right? Then there's a constant tensions. And I think this is really what gets internal dialogue going, right? There's a tendency to change one of the two. Either you say, well, maybe it's not exactly what God wants me to do. Maybe he's more, I don't know, more merciful or so and accepts homosexuality. Then you change your explicit self-understandings, or you try to fight your bodily inclinations and to overcome it. Maybe you might even, probably you will change your feelings and desires to some extent, probably not in the desired ones. But nevertheless, there's always kind of friction and tension and mediation going on between all of these levels. And for example, if your bodily habitus doesn't fit the institutions, that's very interesting too. If you are a wild child who's grown up all the time outside in nature or so on, and then you are forced to sit down for 90 minutes or 4 hours at the school, for example, you really see a problem between your bodily self-understanding, your disposition, the way you are related to the world, and the social practices. So agency, I would really say, is in between all of these. You see, I have two more potential. I find it's also interesting if the self-understanding and the social institutions and practices diverge. You understand yourself, the self-conception you have is very different from the social practices you're related in. That leads to alienation, I would say, right? That's the situation when you ask yourself, what am I doing here, right? This is not the right place for me to be. So, and then you either feel alienated as a subject, or the institutions decay because you don't play by the rules anymore. So agency, I would say, is the result of this is in between what you actually do as an agent, and thereby you reproduce and transform all of those components, is the result of all these four tendencies. So I wonder what you say about these suggestions. And the historical process then is the process of mediation between those. I think sometimes there are sharp ruptures, which you can see that sometimes there is a revolution, and then after that society changes, for example, its institutions and practices or its self-descriptions. I mean, with the East German society, you can really model what happened in 1989 at this very place with this system. At least we tried to do so. And there you would say, well, the beginning of the crisis was that individuals no longer understood themselves as being part of the workers' socialist republic, right? They said, well, that's rubbish. There was a crisis type 2. And then eventually after 1990, they exchanged the whole left side, right? After that, the official self-description was democratic and whatever we are in the Federal Republic, and there was a vast institutional change. But that doesn't necessarily mean that individuals' ancient self-understandings and certainly not their habitus changed immediately. So history is the process, sometimes by rupture, sometimes by incremental change of all those four elements. And I think individual lives are always led in this field of tension. So that's my suggestion for the ontology, right? If you critical theorists as well as critical realists accept this ontology, we have solved that problem. Okay. Now, Margaret Archer suggests, I find this very interesting, that modernity. Oh, I'm doing well with time. I'm happy. I might be too fast, so I slow down. So Margaret Archer suggests that modernity, or no, she doesn't so much talk about modernity, but she has, I would nevertheless say, she has a 3-stage model of society, right? Which is, I think, pretty straightforward. The first one is what she would call morphostatic societies, right? In sociology, we mainly talk about traditional societies. And they are basically characterized by contextual continuity and some form of social stability, right? And so the idea is that the world, I would really say that the world basically stays the same, at least in the conception of the ancients, right? So they act in contextual continuity, and that's what Weber and others describe as the power of tradition, right? How you do things is how you did things in the past. So experience and expectation, as Koselleck calls it, overlap. You know what the future would be like because you can draw on experience. And then she says in modernity there's an increase in dynamics, I would say, which already points towards acceleration, right? There is contextual discontinuity. There's a break with tradition on all levels, in the structural and the cultural level, and even for agents, right? You don't just do what your father did. If he was a baker, that doesn't mean that you have to be a baker too. For example, and if he was Catholic, it doesn't mean you have to be Catholic too. And so that's on the individual level, and it's the same on the collective level. There is a break with tradition. There is a discontinuity in almost all contexts. And she calls this some form of morphogenesis, because there is on all four levels, so to speak, of the ontological realm, there is a reformation of structures and of ideas, of the social components. But nevertheless, she would say in modernity, as Giddens and others I think would say too, that there is a tendency towards some moments of morphostasis coming back, because there are new routines, right, and new forms of continuity, and so it's a kind of morphogenesis with some morphostatic fetters, I think she says, right? She talks about a rerouting of practices and agents. And now she thinks we are moving towards morphogenetic society, or more of a morphogenetic society, where there's really permanent reformation and transformation or elaboration of structures, which means that there's contextual incongruity, right? On all levels, things, you can no longer tell how long they remain stable. There's an inherent tendency towards a change all the time. And while this change is going on, she thinks there's an increase in the extension of reflexivity and also in the mode of reflexivity, right? We move from communicative reflexivity, or from the dominance of communicative reflexivity to the dominance of either fractured, which would be the bad way, or meta-reflexivity. Okay, the problems with this, I think it's very unclear what is the driving wheel. Why does society change in this sense, right? What's the logic, or is there an underlying logic of this, of change? And secondly, how do you define thresholds, or can you define them? Isn't that just a gradual thing which would not allow for having three really different forms of society, which she seems to suggest. So I really think if you introduce the theory of acceleration here, things get much clearer. And I will, since I don't want to present my own ideas extensively, I will keep this very brief. By the way, there's one. If you only read it in English, there's some articles, for example, in Constellations, and there's a small book called Alienation and Acceleration, and the big book will be out with Columbia University Press in June. So, and that's 560 or so pages. So I really give you the very brief version now. The claim is that in modernity, I mean, there's always been this cultural self-perception that modernity somehow changes temporal norms, that life becomes fast, right? You see it in Baudelaire and Baudelaire's definition: the modern is the transitory, the fleeting, the passing. Or you see it with Marx and Engels when they say that capitalist society brings all that is, in capitalist society, all that is solid melts into air. Marshall Behrman then said, okay, that's exactly the heart of modernization or of modernity. And you find it with Rousseau and with many other people. But I would say we never did this systematically, and on most social scientific accounts of modernization, it's about rationalization, individualization, economization or commodification, differentiation and so on. But there has not been, or so far there was no theory of acceleration. Now there is one. And the idea is that acceleration comes on three different levels, or in three different forms, which of course are connected, but analytically we should distinguish them. One is technological acceleration, the acceleration of transport, of communication, and of the production of things and services. The Industrial Revolution really was a speed revolution, right? They didn't want to make new things. They wanted to make the things on a much faster scale. Of course, it has a lot to do with capitalism. That's obvious. And even the digital revolution now, it just allows us to do things much faster than before. So technological acceleration is the intentional speed up of goal-directed processes, mainly but not only in the realms of transport, communication, production, also in organizational terms. But then there's a different form which you cannot analytically reduce to it. And this is very much what Margaret Archer has in mind when she talks about contextual incongruity, or first discontinuity and then incongruity. And that means that the way things are or the time span in which things stay the same seems to contract. That's why I use Hermann Löbbe's idea of a contraction of the present. And that just means that you could really say on the levels of culture, structure and agency, things tend to change at higher rates. The rates of change are increasing. The world becomes unstable in many aspects. You see it in social practice, for example, right? The way you use a telephone has been, I mean, there was no telephone. That's the cultural discontinuity, for example, right? Then there is one, but it stayed the same for 40 years or so. Everyone knew how to telephone. And then now they invent new machines all the time. So it seems, so there's a kind of contraction of the present, because now the way to use telephones changes at a very high rate. And it's the same with for example, with university orders and rules or whatever. It's a bit hard. It's quite difficult to see how you measure the rates of social change. But on the 598 pages, I had quite some time, and I made a lot of attempts to show that this is really true. And since it's exactly the same point as Archer makes about increasing contextual incongruity, I don't want to go into the details here. But the idea is the stability of the world decreases in temporal terms because the rates of change increase. And that leads, I believe, to a situation where agents have the feeling that they stand on slippery slopes, is a term I like to use, right? That we have to run faster and faster just to stay in place. That's an overwhelming impression which time use studies produce. I think sometimes actually it's quite useful to look at even empirical data, because it gives you a hint on where problems could lay. I think the problem really is when you think that's already the explanation. You find a correlation and you think, now I've explained it. I totally agree that's not an explanation, but it might actually help to look for problems. So people react to this situation by trying to increase the pace of their life, right? We try to do more things within a given period of time, a day or an hour or a lifetime. And we do this by acting faster, by trying to compress the actions themselves with fast food or speed dating or power naps or quality time with kids or drive-through funerals or whatever you might have in mind. They actually have such a practice in Nevada. Or we try to get more things done within a period of time by trying to get rid of pauses and intervals and breaks and waiting times. We try to synchronize as closely as possible, for example, to take the train, which starts even before the conference is over, right, in order to not lose time in between, so you can get more things done within a day. And thirdly, we have we try multitasking, right? Using the telephone is no longer enough. It doesn't compress time enough. So while you use the telephone, you also surf in the computer or do something else. So this has become a self-propelling system, which is also driven by 3 external forces. I don't want to go into this. One is capitalism, or the logic of competition. The second is the principle of functional differentiation. And the third is a certain cultural ideal which predominates in modernity, where in the end you could actually say that acceleration has become the functional equivalent, as Luhmann would have it, for the idea of eternal life. It leads to something like the idea of an eternal life before death. The idea is that if you live on the cultural side, right, if you live indefinitely fast, you don't have to be afraid of death. Because yes, you have to die at the age of 80 or so, but before that you can do an indefinite number of things, right? You can have the whole, you can take in, so to speak, the whole world before you die. So there are cultural elements, capitalist elements, and I'm agnostic on this point. I can certainly live with the idea that in the end it all boils down to capitalism. But nevertheless, there are other elements or elective affinities which drive the system. So what do you get by this? Oh, I'm not doing well with time, but I speed up. No, okay. So I think I end up with something which fits very well with Margaret Archer, right? You could actually say, if the speed of change, that's the second realm, right? If the so to speak, if the contextual continuity is intergenerational, then people have then that has consequences for the perception of time. Then people have the idea that they share one world. I think really Reinhard Koselleck, the historian, is very useful here. He says if the speed of change, if contextual continuity is longer than 80 or about 80 years, right? Then the grandmother and the granddaughter, for example, share the same world. Then the grandmother will not say, "Look, kid, in our world it's such and such." She would just say, in the world has these features. We share one world, and what I experienced is the same that you will experience. So we tend to interpret this as pre-modernity, right? 5 minutes? Oh, that's fine. Okay, so then there is a conception of cyclical time. What we expect from the future is what we know from the past, and there's contextual continuity. But then when there's speed of change, when there's contextual discontinuity, and Koselleck, but also many sociologists, Ansgar Weimann, for example, they say modernity is the idea that every generation makes the world anew, right? So that's contextual discontinuity. We are moving towards a generational pace of change, and the direct consequence is that the grandfather, for example, tells the grandson, "My world is different from yours," right? When I was young, it made sense to become a carpenter. But in your world, it's much more important to go to university or so on. And there you really see, and you see this, the whole idea, the ideology of modernity, from Hegel through the Bildungsromane, right, is that every individual has to find her own place in the world, right? Find a job, found a family, define your political outlook, find your stance towards the religious world. That's contextual discontinuity. I totally agree with Archer, right? And the idea is every person finds her own position towards the world. But in late modernity, we have now moved towards an intragenerational pace of change, right? It's no longer our world and the world of our parents and grandparents, but we think the world changes all the time. That actually makes the generations again live in one world. They say now it's like this, tomorrow it might be different, right? That's contextual incongruity, and you can see when you look at temporality. For example, Manuel Castells talks about timeless time, right? There is no longer this idea of a moving history. In the past it was like that, in the future it will be like that. It's rather like a world of instability where things change and some things stay stable for some time, but you don't know how long things will remain stable or unstable. So contextual incongruity is the consequence of a pace of change that has become intragenerational. And I already talked about the positioning of the individual in the world, right? In the first world, where pace of change is intergenerational, the position of the subject in the world is prefixed. Who you are, you find from looking at your parents, but also at some outer world, at the order of the estates, for example, right? So the position is given, and identity is potentially trans-individual. In modernity, the idea is that you have stable identities which are not prefixed. You find it for themselves, but then once you know who you are, you found your family, find a place to live, have a job, then there is new form. That's what Margaret Archer calls rerouting, right? That's contextual discontinuity. You break with the world of your parents, but then you develop continuity in your own life. And in our late modern situation, we no longer, in that sense, have an identity. With Margaret Archer, I think you could talk about performative identities or situational identities, right? You have to redefine yourself and your position on a performative level. That's actually what I did, and I didn't do it on purpose, right? When I say, well, maybe I'm not a critical theorist anymore, right? I'm now a critical realist. That's kind of contextual, situational redefinition. And I think... And I think this actually goes very well with the changing modes of reflexivity. For the different forms of positioning, you need different forms of reflexivity. So hopefully, yes. So that was my second point. So what basically the claim here is, yes, Margaret Archer is quite right, but she would be much better off if she embraced acceleration theory. So, so my final point, and this I really would like to discuss with you, is basically my claim is that it's an illusion that our present situation is one of a society of morphogenesis, right? Because for the following reason, Margaret Archer says, I'm always tempted to say Margaret Thatcher, that's really unfair. Okay. So Margaret Archer says a morphostatic configuration, right, is one whose effects are structurally and culturally restorative of the status quo. And she thinks our late modern society is no longer oriented towards the status quo, but towards permanent remaking of the structures, of the morphs. So at least that's how I read her, right? And now, if you contrast this to what we do in Jena, right? We say, the interesting thing about our modern society is that we can only reproduce the status quo, stay as we are, if we grow and accelerate and change and innovate, right? So the claim really is that what Archer, I think, doesn't see, or mainly doesn't see enough, or maybe I just didn't read it in her work, is that in fact, this frantic change, right, that forces individuals to redefine themselves situationally or performatively is reproducing the status quo on a deeper level. So this society is very rock bottom morphostatic. It's not changing. It forces us to accelerate, to grow, and to innovate incessantly, only to keep the status quo. You see this in the economy, right? The economy needs to grow. That's what politicians tell us all the time. So why do we need to grow? Not because we want to go somewhere, not because we want to change or overcome some scarcity, but if we don't grow, then there will be loss of jobs, closing down of economies, breaking down of the financial system, of the welfare state, and in the end, the loss of political legitimacy. So we cannot keep up the status quo without incessant innovation, growth, and acceleration. And therefore, yeah, I know I'm done. This is my last slide. Right? So the claim is modern societies keep the status quo only by accelerating and by change and growth and by producing contextual incongruity, right? Contextual incongruity is a necessary feature of our attempt to remain morphostatic. So morphogenesis is only a surface phenomenon. Beneath it, there is structural and cultural inertia, the iron cage, or what Thatcher calls, now it's really Thatcher, Taina. There is no alternative, right, to the political system. I already said this. I think there is one problem, one last problem. This is my last slide, so you don't be afraid, right? I think in the end, this makes me almost like a structuralist, right? Because I would say the changes you have on the right-hand side, on the individual side, that we now define ourselves as a late modern flexible selves, and that we act on the mode of meta-reflexivity, is not something we decided as agents or we came up with as agents. It's a necessity by the logic of status quo reproduction. So I think in the end, The structures, at least in my own account, are very strong, but I'm very hopeful that you convince me I'm wrong there, because otherwise the picture would be very pessimistic. Thanks a lot for listening.